Week 14 quarterback rankings heading into the fantasy playoffs this week. Top 15. Number 1, Russell Wilson of the Seattle Seahawks. Russell Wilson, he's been struggling a lot of late. He's had 4 mediocre ball games now over the last few weeks, and last week in a matchup versus the New York Giants, who I thought he would have a huge game. He didn't do much with Wilson. 263 passing yards with a touchdown and an interception. So it was another bad game for Wilson. But this week, I think everything comes together, and he has a huge game here versus the New York Jets. And this is the type of game Wilson and the Seahawks need here to win this ball game and play well. So Wilson, he could have a huge game where I think he could get 40, 45 fantasy points if everything comes together like I said. And I think he's going to take his frustration out on the Jets here. He'll give up the third amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. So Wilson, I'm going to rank him number 1, and I think he finally breaks out. Number 2, Patrick Mahomes of the Kansas City Chiefs. For whatever reason, Mahomes has his worst games versus the Denver Broncos, and he did last week. He still threw for 318 yards, but he only had the 1 score, and he had 4 rushing attempts for 26 yards as Mahomes. This week, it's a tough matchup in Miami, but at least the weather's probably going to be there, and Mahomes is a stud. He's a guy, he'll bounce back. He'll get probably 30, 35 fantasy points. It was a fluky thing that he threw 1 touchdown last week versus Denver. Like I said, Denver, for whatever reason, plays Mahomes well. I don't know if it's in the division or whatever, but still, I think Mahomes bounces back and has a huge game and leads your teams to the next round of the playoffs. Number 3, Aaron Rodgers of the Green Bay Packers. Rodgers, an amazing season for him, and once again, he cracked 30 fantasy points for the 7th week in a row is Rodgers. And this week, he's got another cupcake matchup versus the Detroit Lions, a team that he absolutely owns over his career is Rodgers. And this week, I think he's going to throw for a huge ball game. I could see him go for 300-400 yards and 3 or 4 touchdowns in this one. They got no answer for Adams. I think Aaron Jones has a big game as well, and Rodgers, he's just going to go off in this one, and he's easily the number 3 option here this week. Number 4, Deshaun Watson of the Houston Texans. Watson, he finds ways to get a lot of passing yards and make a lot of plays, even last week, but Will Fuller suspended for the rest of the season. Deshaun Watson, he found a way to get 318 yards in that ball game. This week, another tough matchup in Chicago, but I don't care. Watson, he makes receivers better. He makes plays, and last week we even saw Kiki Kuti get 8 catches for 141 yards. So Watson, this guy's a top 5 quarterback. He's going to have a big ball game, and I could see him get 30 points, even in a tough matchup versus Chicago. We saw Matthew Stafford throw for 400 yards versus Chicago last week. So Watson, why not? Number 5, Ryan Tannehill of the Tennessee Titans. This guy, he's been better in fantasy than in real life, and last week he had a nice fantasy game once again with 35 fantasy points in a game where the Tennessee Titans were trailing early and often, where he had no choice but to throw. And this guy, he's got great weapons on his offense. He's got Derrick Henry, obviously, Corey Davis, who exploded with a 182-yard game, and A.J. Brown and Jonnu Smith if he plays this week. But Tannehill versus Jacksonville, that gives up the 4th amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. It's a plus matchup, and I could see him go for 35 again, possibly, in this one. So start Tannehill. Number 6, Tom Brady of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Brady was on bye week, and this week he versus a Minnesota Viking team that they're sustainable to giving up points to quarterbacks. And Brady, I could see him unleash in this one, where he comes out off the bye after this Buck team coming off of 2 bad losses in a row, and he absolute torches this Minnesota Viking defense. And Brady, I think he could go for 350 in this one and 3 or 4 touchdowns, and I think he's a safe play this week. And ranking number 6. Number 7, Kyler Murray of the Arizona Cardinals. Murray, he's been struggling now the last 2 weeks, where he did have pretty tough matchups, and this week it's going to be another tough one versus the New York Giants, who they got one of the best front sevens on their defensive line. All of a sudden now, over the last few weeks, this unit's playing tough. They're getting to the quarterback, and they're not making these quarterbacks make plays. We saw them contain Russell Wilson last week, and I think this week they're going to contain Murray to a certain extent. And plus, they got to travel cross-country as this Cardinal team. So it's going to be a tough one. Murray, I wouldn't be surprised if he only scores 15 or 20 fantasy points, or if he goes off. So I got him in the middle here at number 7. Number 8, Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. Ryan last week with a mediocre game. He started the game very slow, but at least he finished a fantasy day and salvaged it with 19 fantasy points. And this week he's got a great matchup at the Los Angeles Chargers. Another indoor game for Ryan. His 2 receivers in Julio Jones and Ridley should be good to go once again this week. And Ryan, I think he could get upwards 25 to 30 fantasy points in this one. And like I said, he could pass on this Charger team that gives up a lot of points. And Ryan, I think he bounces back and he could have 2 or 3 touchdowns in this one. Number 9, Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. He had his worst game as a pro last week versus the New England Patriots. And this week, he's got a great matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons that give up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks. But Herbert, I'm a little bit on the fence about him now after that horrible ball game last week that cost many managers making the fantasy playoffs last week. Herbert, though, I think he bounces back. I don't think he has a super game where he'll score 35, 40 points. But here at number 9, I think it's a safe way to put him after coming off of 2 lousy ball games for the most part. Number 10, Lamar Jackson of the Baltimore Ravens. He went off last night with a nice 29-point fantasy day. But if it wasn't for the rushing yards, Jackson, he wouldn't have done much. He had 13 rush attempts for 94 yards and a touchdown and 107 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. So Jackson, he went off versus a weak Dallas Cowboy defense. This week, he's going to verse the real deal in a Cleveland Brown team that's really playing well on defense and making plays. And Jackson, he's been mediocre most of the season to poor at best. But last night, it was good to see him break out versus Dallas in a game we pretty much knew he would. Dallas, they can't stop nobody at all this season. And Jackson, he's a guy I got ranked 9th rest of the season at quarterback. So check that video out if you haven't, rest of the season rankings. So Jackson, I think he has a decent game, but nothing crazy like he did last night versus Dallas. Number 11, Big Ben Roethlisberger of the Pittsburgh Steelers versus the Washington football team. He had a decent game, and I think it's going to be more of the same this week in Buffalo. This is going to be a tough game in Buffalo. Buffalo playing good, coming off a great Monday Night Football victory is Buffalo. And Big Ben, I still think he has a good game, but this week, I just like these other quarterbacks who have better matchups. But Ben, I could see him scoring 20, 25 fantasy points in this one. And he's also getting James Conner most likely back over there in the backfield, so that will help as well. Number 12, Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. This guy, he's been a beast pretty much the whole season. He had a 3 or 4 week stretch where he was slumping and he couldn't get the job done. But Allen now, the last few weeks, he's been insane for fantasy owners. Last week, 380-plus yards and 4 touchdowns versus San Francisco. This week, the matchup gets much tougher for Allen, but he's still going to throw the ball. This guy's a gunslinger. He makes plays with his legs. And in this one, I'm going to get down to 20, 22 fantasy points because the Steelers, they give up the least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. And Allen, I don't think it's going to be a throw party. It's going to be more of a grind-out type of game like it was for him a few weeks ago versus the Chargers. So I think Allen comes down to earth a little bit. So he's number 12. Number 13, Taysom Hill of the New Orleans Saints. Hill with a great ball game last week versus a weak Atlanta Falcon team. This week, he'll have a little tougher of a matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles up front. We're still pretty solid in that category. But anyway, I think Taysom Hill, he'll get his rushing yards, he'll make a few plays, and I think the Saints will win this game. But it's going to be a good matchup to see Jalen Hurts versus Taysom Hill in this one. But Hill at 13, he's a guy I think you could start with decent confidence in most fantasy leagues. If obviously you don't have these 12 guys I have it ranked ahead of him. Hill, you know he's going to help you in the running category. Last week he got you an extra 8 points from the rushing way, and most of the goal line touches he's taken himself into the end zone. So I like him at 13. Number 14, Phillip Rivers of the Indianapolis Colts. It's been a great season for Rivers. In the last 4 or 5 weeks, he's kicked it into gear. And last week with another pretty solid ball game, 22 fantasy points for Phillip Rivers. Now he's got a great matchup versus the Vegas Raiders that give up the 13th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. It's another indoor game for Rivers, and that's what's so great about his schedule. 4 indoor games in a row for Rivers, and this week I think he has a good ball game. We just saw Sam Darnold throw all over that Raider defense. If you need a quarterback in a pinch, and especially 2 quarterback leagues, Phillip Rivers, he's the guy to get, and he's a guy underappreciated and still out there in about 60% of leagues. So check that out too if you want to get him. And the 15th and final guy at quarterback this week's Matthew Stafford of the Detroit Lions. Stafford had a huge fantasy line last week with over 400 yards and 2 touchdowns in that come-from-behind victory versus the Chicago Bears. In that game, Stafford, he just kept going. His team kept playing, and they pulled it out with a big victory. And this week versus Green Bay, more of the same it's going to be for Stafford, especially if DeAndre Swift's out again. It's going to be a lot of throwing, a lot of attempts. They're probably going to have to play catch-up ball. And I like those numbers in Stafford's favor, where he just has to keep throwing and keep playing with his team down. And plus, it's an indoor game. You don't have to deal with the bad weather in Green Bay. So that's the top 15 quarterbacks I'm ranking for Week 14.